Luisa had always dreamed of living alone, enjoying the freedom to decorate and organize her house as she pleased, and finally, living in peace. When she found that old house in a quiet neighborhood in Mexico City, everything seemed perfect. The house was spacious, with a modest garden and architectural details that reflected its long history. However, shortly after moving in, small incidents began to happen. At first, they were small things: a book that disappeared from the shelf and reappeared somewhere else, or a glass that seemed to have been moved. Luisa didn't worry, attributing these incidents to her own distraction or the fact that she was still getting used to the new house. But as the days passed, the events became more frequent and strange. Objects disappeared completely, and she began to feel a presence, an uncomfortable sensation of being watched. The nights in the old house were quiet, except for the noises that Luisa began to hear. It was as if light footsteps echoed in the hallway, and doors creaked as they moved on their own. A cold wind seemed to circulate through the rooms, even though all the windows were closed. Luisa tried to rationalize what was happening, telling herself that it was just the age of the house, that the walls were settling, or that the wind was stronger than it seemed. Luisa had no pets, but the old house had a small dog door in the back door. She felt uncomfortable with it, thinking it would be an easy entrance for an animal or even a person, but she never blocked it, thinking it would be unnecessary. However, the nighttime noises always seemed to come from the direction of that small door. One day, Luisa came home earlier than usual. She noticed something was wrong as soon as she stepped inside. There was a disturbing silence, as if the house was holding its breath. She walked slowly through the rooms, searching for the source of that feeling. When she entered the bedroom, her heart nearly stopped when she saw the closet door slightly open. She knew she had left that door closed before leaving. With trembling hands, Luisa cautiously opened the closet door. A strangled scream got stuck in her throat when she found a man crouched inside, his eyes wide with surprise at being discovered. He looked dirty, with torn clothes and a horrible smell emanating from his body. Before she could react, he stood up, clearly preparing to attack her. Adrenaline took over Luisa, and she ran as fast as she could out of the bedroom, down the stairs toward the front door. She heard the man running after her, but she didn't look back. Her trembling fingers could barely turn the key in the lock, but, by some miracle, she managed to open the door and escape into the street. Luisa's screams caught the attention of neighbors, who quickly called the police. The police arrived quickly, but the man had already fled. They investigated the house and found evidence that the intruder had been using the small dog door to enter the house. They also found a hiding spot with food scraps and clothes in the basement, indicating that he had been hiding there for some time. The idea that someone had been living in her house, coming and going as they pleased while she slept peacefully upstairs, was terrifying. Even after moving, Luisa never managed to get rid of the nightmares. She repeatedly dreamed of the man, imagining what could have happened if she hadn't come home early that day. The noises, the missing objects, the man's disturbing gaze, everything kept replaying in her mind, turning terror into a constant presence in her life. After the incident, Luisa moved to a smaller apartment in the city center, where she felt safer. The busy streets and neighbors always nearby gave her a false sense of tranquility, but the fear was still there, seeping into her deepest thoughts. Luisa avoided talking about what had happened, fearing that people wouldn't believe her, or worse, that they would think she was becoming paranoid. Determined to regain control of her life, Luisa returned to work, focusing on her daily activities to push the dark memories away. She began meeting friends again, but with every laugh or casual conversation, the shadow of what she had lived through loomed over her. At night, the memories were impossible to ignore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man in the closet, waiting in the dark, his empty eyes watching her. The nightmares began to intensify. Luisa would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, as if she were still running. She dreamed of endless hallways, doors that never opened, and a constant presence behind her, ready to attack. In her dreams, the old house mixed with her new apartment, the rooms blending and distorting, creating a labyrinth from which she couldn't escape. During the day, Luisa started to notice small things that bothered her. They were subtle details, like a feeling of being watched while walking down the street or when she was alone at home. She tried to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her, a result of the trauma she had experienced. However, the feeling that something or someone was always near, lurking, was undeniable. Everything changed when Louisa began receiving anonymous messages on her phone. At first, they were simple phrases like, "I'm watching you," or "I miss you." Louisa blocked the number, but the messages kept coming from different senders. The language used in the messages was disturbingly familiar, echoing the same threatening tone she had felt when facing the man in the closet. Desperate, Louisa decided to hire a private investigator. She needed to find out who was behind the messages and whether it was possible that the man had found her again. The investigator, an experienced man named Javier, took the situation seriously from the start. He began following leads, tracing numbers, and trying to uncover the origin of the messages, but everything led to dead ends. Part 2. After weeks of no progress, Javier finally brought information that shook Louisa to her core. The messages weren't coming from a single number, they were being sent from various different locations, as if someone were using technology to mask their whereabouts. Moreover, Javier discovered that the messages coincided with Louisa's location, meaning the person responsible knew exactly where she was at all times. Now, the terror Louisa felt was different. It was no longer just psychological. It was a tangible threat, present in her daily life. She started avoiding going out, locking all doors and windows, and keeping her phone in hand at all times, ready to call the police. The sense of helplessness was devastating. No matter how much she tried to protect herself, she didn't know where the threat was coming from or how to fight it. One night, while returning home, Louisa again felt that sensation of being watched, but this time, it was more intense. When she reached the building's parking lot, she saw a man standing near her car. He was facing away from her, but something about his posture made her heart race. She backed away, ready to run, but the man slowly turned around. It was the same empty gaze that haunted her nightmares, the same one she had seen in the closet. Louisa's world seemed to slow down as she stared at the man in the parking lot. Her legs trembled, and panic spread through her body like a paralyzing poison. He took a step toward her, and at that moment, something inside Louisa broke. She screamed for help and ran in the opposite direction, but the empty parking lot muffled her cry. The man quickened his pace, his movements precise and determined. Desperate, Louisa reached the building's entrance and began hammering the intercom button for someone to open the door. She looked back. The man was almost upon her. When the door finally opened, she threw herself inside, quickly locking it behind her. The man slammed into the glass, staring at her with an expression she would never forget. But instead of trying to break down the door, he stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. Louisa contacted Javier immediately after the incident. She could barely speak, her voice trembling as she recounted what had happened. Javier, concerned, said he would come to the building to inspect the site and review the security cameras. Louisa knew she needed to find out who this man was and how he was managing to follow her without leaving any trace. There was something more, something she still couldn't understand. Javier spent hours reviewing the security footage, and what he found made Louisa's blood run cold. The cameras clearly showed the man following her through the parking lot, but after he backed away, the footage became distorted, as if the system had been tampered with by an invisible force. Javier, intrigued, tried to trace the source of the problem, but everything seemed to point back to the same conclusion. The building's security system had been manipulated to fail at that specific moment. Feeling cornered, Louisa began questioning everything she knew about the incident at the old house. What if what happened to her wasn't an isolated case? What if the man who attacked her wasn't acting alone? The house, the missing objects, the noises, everything began to make sense. Louisa decided to return to the old neighborhood, speak with the neighbors, and find out if anything similar had happened to others. In the old neighborhood, Louisa found an elderly neighbor who remembered her and the house. The woman hesitated before speaking but finally confessed that the house had a dark reputation. Several previous tenants had reported strange incidents, similar to what Louisa had experienced. However, what disturbed her the most was learning that, decades ago, the house belonged to a family involved in occult practices. The man she had seen could be a descendant or someone connected to this macabre history. As Javier continued to investigate the leads, he found something terrifying in the basement of the old house. On a wall covered by a false panel, there were symbols carved into the brick. Nearby, an old box contained candles and small bones, likely from animals. The conclusion was inevitable. The house had been the site of dark ritual, and somehow, Luisa had become entangled in it. Now, Luisa knew she needed to confront the man once and for all. She and Javier devised a plan: lure the stalker to an isolated location where they could finally confront him and uncover his intentions. Javier set a trap in an abandoned building, using Luisa as bait. Luisa knew it was risky, but she couldn't continue living in constant terror. On the appointed day, Luisa waited in the abandoned building, with Javier hidden in the shadows, ready to act. It didn't take long for the man to appear. This time, he seemed different, more confident, as if he knew he was about to close the loop. As he approached Luisa, Javier stepped out of hiding and confronted him, but the man didn't back down. Instead, he smiled, a cold, lifeless smile, before revealing something that left Luisa terrified. Part 3. The man, with that sinister smile, revealed something that made Luisa's world collapse. He pulled an old black and white photo from his pocket, worn by time, and handed it to her. In the photo, a woman who looked exactly like Luisa, but from a much earlier time. "She is my mother," he said, in a low, menacing voice. Luisa froze, trying to process his words. How could this be possible? The woman in the photo was her double, but Luisa had no knowledge of distant relatives, let alone such a disturbing story. Javier, realizing the gravity of the situation, took the photo from Luisa's hands and studied it. In the background of the image, the old house was clearly visible, but the most terrifying thing was the man standing next to the woman, with the same empty gaze that Luisa recognized. It was the stalker, but much younger. "That house cursed my family," the man continued. "You shouldn't have moved there, you shouldn't have awakened all of this." With the truth finally exposed, the man began to tell the story. His mother, the woman in the photo, had lived in the house decades ago. Involved in occult rituals, she made a pact that trapped the man's spirit in the house, condemning him to wander between the world of the living and the dead. When Luisa moved in, something was triggered, something that brought the man back to finish what had been started. He believed that Luisa was the key to either freeing him or condemning him forever. The man then offered Luisa a choice. If she agreed to complete the ritual that her mother had begun, he would be freed, but she would have to sacrifice something precious in return. Otherwise, he would continue to haunt her until she was destroyed by fear. Javier tried to intervene, but the man, with supernatural strength, immobilized him. The decision was entirely in Luisa's hands. Luisa, trembling with fear and anger, looked at Javier, who was struggling to free himself. She knew that if she completed the ritual, she would not only free the man, but also seal her own fate, tying herself to her mother's pact. However, living in constant terror was no longer an option. She made her decision. "I accept," she said, firmly. The man began to guide Luisa through the ritual. With precise gestures and words in an ancient language, he had her repeat incantations, lighting candles and drawing symbols on the floor. The atmosphere in the abandoned building became charged. The air seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy. When the ritual reached its climax, an invisible force took hold of Luisa, and she felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something was being ripped from her soul. With the ritual complete, the man stood up, apparently free from the curse. But instead of fleeing, he began to disintegrate before Luisa's eyes. "You did what needed to be done," he said with one last smile before disappearing into a cloud of ashes. Luisa, exhausted and in shock, collapsed to her knees, trying to understand what had just happened. When Javier finally freed himself and ran to Luisa, she was different. There was a calmness in her eyes, an acceptance of what had been sacrificed. She realized that the pact hadn't only freed the man but also cursed her. The price for her freedom was her own connection to the world of the living. Luisa now bore the burden that her mother had left behind, but with it came the power to decide how to use this new force. With the stalker finally gone, Luisa knew she would never be the same. She left the abandoned building with Javier, determined to rebuild her life, but with a new understanding. She was free, but at the same time, bound to a dark destiny. Luisa knew that although she had overcome the terror, she was now part of something much larger and more sinister. But in time, perhaps she would find a way to use this power to her advantage. Did you enjoy this terrifying story? Then don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more impactful tales like this. Share with your friends and help spread the fear and curiosity. And remember, True terror may be much closer than you think.